All right, hello and welcome to episode number 13 of our Bamboo Chalupa digital marketing podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the president of Knucklepuck, and I am joined by Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So in this episode, we're actually in part 2 of a 3-part series that focuses about building better content for SEO. You know, we've all heard that old adage that content is king, but knowing that doesn't help us get any better at leveraging content. And so this 3-part series on content for SEO focuses on enhancing the power of your marketing through targeted, optimized content. In part 1 of this series, we talked about developing and executing a comprehensive content plan that you can use to generate sustainable results with your content marketing. Today, we're going to talk about taking that plan and using it to create content that engages, excites, and entertains your audience. And in part 3 of this 3-part series, we're going to talk about the bread and butter of content marketing, and that is promotion. You spend all this time putting together your comprehensive plan. You've made sure that you go and you create the content, this awesome comprehensive resource. Now you want to make sure that the audience out there that you crafted this content for is ready and available to consume the content that you pushed out.
All right, and again, this episode, part 2, actually creating the content. There's going to be a theme that will run throughout. When we're talking about choosing the right media mix, creating, choosing your sources, choosing the format, all that, and that is finding the right balance between being comprehensive and being perfect and being timely and getting it out there. We actually spent an entire episode on episode 1 talking about having an agile approach to SEO. And basically it boils down to not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And when we talk about creating content on the internet, one thing to remember is that unlike the physical world, creating a new edition or a new revision doesn't require a new print run. If it's something like a blog post, you can go in and edit, revise, and hit update. And one of the great things about having content on the internet, having a digital version, is that you can iterate, update, and reevaluate based on feedback. And so we're going to talk a lot about getting the format right, what kind of time to spend on it, what the right media mix, how that integrates with your promotion plan. But that's going to be a running theme whenever you're creating content, is that it's never going to do yourself any good to let it sit in your drafts folder.
Internet content is only valuable when it's accessible to the internet. And to Nate's point here, we have to make sure that as we're producing this content, that we're not sitting there and letting a good opportunity pass us by, letting a good topic slip through our fingers, not completing what we started, which is one of the biggest complaints that I've heard from people in content marketing, that they have so many drafts. I know I've got 8, 9, 10 unfinished drafts in my WordPress site, and that's just for my fun and games. The idea here is that we have to get this content out the door. We want to make sure that it's comprehensive and timely, but ultimately it only benefits us if it's published and the audience is out there to be able to receive it.
All right, so let's go ahead and stay on this topic of time and go ahead and address that right at the front end. So last time we were talking about planning out the content, and I think we're going to default towards a blog section, but this also applies to white papers. It also applies to resource sections, interactive microsites. And when it comes
It also applies to, just to jump in here, it also applies to non-text content.
Oh yeah.
It applies to anything, any multimedia, anything you might do with, with imagery, especially if you're looking for particularly maybe a Pinterest campaign. If you're talking about doing videos, you're talking about doing something like a Bamboo Chalupa podcast. There's a whole lot of different ways that content can be defined, and we're going to kind of frame it through the more popular blog platform or blog channel that Nate was mentioning. But really, these principles are designed to allow you to enhance the creation of any content that you want to use to help support your SEO campaigns.
Yeah, and so the first thing I'll say about time is that rushed content is usually bad content. I think there is a predisposition on the internet about being fresh is always the best. Being the first one out there is always the best. And there are huge rewards. I won't deny, for being the early adopter, being the first one to publish breaking news. But if you are not a news publisher, there's no sense in playing in that space. And, going back to our previous episode where we talked about planning, give yourself enough time and resources to do the content that you planned on producing that's going to meet the goals that you outlined to make that high quality. Assume that it's going to take a little bit longer than you think, and recognize that the creation and the publication are two different steps. You need to have a draft before you can have a post that you hit publish on. And you have to recognize that the creation is not only a separate step, but it's oftentimes a multi-step process, and that you can't just go and do it.
And you talk about this multi-step process, and just to expand a little bit more on, I like what you said there, where you say you first have to have a draft before you can publish something. And a lot of times when it comes to creation or creativity in general, getting that initial momentum going, starting spinning that flywheel that we've talked about on a number of our episodes here, that is the initial lift that often drives people away from content marketing. When you can start to get yourself into a position where you know what you planned out, you knew what the goals were for the content before you started, you had a couple of your preliminary sources, now you're able to go and start to get something down on paper, or in our case, down on your computer. You have the information that goes into your draft. So then instead of having to create something from scratch, you're able to either, you move from creating to augmenting or adding. And then you go from augmenting to refining almost. You go a little bit too far and then pull back and make sure that you're very detailed. And then from there, ultimately, you finally arrive at this final product that has gone through this multi-step creation process, but you recognize the fact that there is value in making sure that you can write, say, in stream of consciousness. For me personally, when I produce content, one of the first things that I do is I sit down and I just write. And it's a very popular technique that professional writers and academics recommend all the time. So just make sure that you can write without really thinking about the final product. Just get a draft in there. Because once you have the draft in there, you can edit, you can refine, you can update. But at the end of the day, you had to get that initial content in there so that you could get that ball rolling.
Yeah, and I think in a way, this is even more of a key concept when you're working with teams. I think about, especially from an agency perspective, whenever you're working with a client trying to, maybe get a thought leadership piece to a publication or sync up an interview with journalists, a lot of times it's really hard to coordinate everything, especially if you're submitting, say, a thought leadership piece. But it's important to remember that getting the facts down, getting V1, where everyone can give feedback, everyone can edit, is the bottleneck. And so if you can just get a V1, get a draft, you can, that's sort of the key that unlocks the rest of the process of creation.
I couldn't agree more with that. And once you get that initial momentum rolling, the creation process really becomes a lot easier. And so let's talk a little bit about what goes into the actual posts that you're going to publish on your website, the actual elements that go into this piece of content to make sure that it accomplishes those goals you laid out in the planning process, and then it's able to be promoted, which we're going to talk about in our next episode.
Yeah, and what we're really talking about here is figuring out the right media mix. Unless you're writing a certain type of content, a blog post or resource section doesn't always have to be all text, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all video. A lot of the best content is going to be things that mix and match different forms of content in really interesting ways to make it truly engaging. And there's a lot of ways that you can take this, but usually where I personally start is to try to create the resource that I would like to use in the world. I know for myself, whenever I'm looking at other marketing blog posts, I love to see screenshots. I love to see a short, quick video overview. I'm very visual. And so whenever I'm creating a piece of content, that I will try to remember to break in screenshots, videos. And again, this is going to really depend on your vertical and your resources, but at least I would recommend that as a starting point. Especially if you're already reading a lot of content in your industry and you really have a good feel of what form of content you like, and especially if you can go beyond that and know the form of content that your audience has a liking to.
And I think that there's a caveat here where we talk about, we talk about in SEO all the time that you want to put yourself in the mind state of your user. And I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to look at it and say, create the content that you want to engage with. But it has to be understood that as marketers, there is the base assumption that what we are interested in is already in the mindset of a user. As marketers, we have to be both sides of the conversation. We have to be speaking and listening. We have to know that what we are going to create is something that will resonate with our audience because we have internalized what it is our audience is interested in. And then we can take some of the, strategies that Nate mentioned where include the visuals, the imagery that you would find most valuable. And the other caveat to that is to extend beyond just you. Have your entire team, not your marketing team, not your content team, the entire team that works on your business or in your agency is a sounding board for figuring out what the audience is most interested in. Take advantage of asking your husband or your wife when you get home, what do they think? Ask your parents, ask somebody who is not as invested or involved in your industry that you may be. Find somebody who has an entirely different perspective, at least give you an educated understanding of what type of content is going to be most valuable to the greatest number of users that are going to be on the receiving end of that content.
I love that tip about asking your husband or spouse. I think we marketing people, and especially content marketing people, get tunnel vision really fast. And we forget that people browsing on the internet, they're not stupid. Like, they have specific reasons for liking specific things. And we forget how quickly people can just click over to something else they like. Let's say you have a beauty website or a clothing website and you're putting together a interesting content. If it's not in the right form that people want to see, if it's not well put together, Pinterest is a click away. Same goes for YouTube, and same goes for any number of industries.
And I think it gives you a new perspective where you may have a blind spot to certain things. And a lot of times, especially as marketers, we have a blind spot to the things that don't align with our vision of the world or our vision of our product or service. So bringing in somebody who has a little bit more of an objective viewpoint will help you identify those blind spots and correct them before you actually go out and you publish a piece of content that comes off, in a best case scenario, you come off as, naive. In a worst case scenario, you come off as insensitive or ignorant. And this is the way that you can prevent that by taking advantage of all the resources that are available to you when you go out there and you create the content during the creation process, but also when we get down to the iterating and the finalizing the content as well.
Definitely agree. And once you kind of get the media mix that you want to have, that's when I think you can really move into solidifying and defining the format that you want this in. Ideally, you would determine the format when you're planning it out. But a lot of times when you get into the creation process, it's important not to be locked in to a certain way. I think this is actually something that Evan touched on a couple episodes ago when he was talking about, building a website from scratch and building audience and defining your brand voice, is that a lot of times once you get into the creation phase, something won't quite work. And it's important to be able to change up the format, whether it's starting on an infographic and realizing that, this needs a little bit more text to build it out. Sometimes it's a video or podcast format or a white paper that really is not substantial enough to exist in that format, and being able to switch over to a different format.
And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you go out there looking to write a post. When Nate and I first started talking about this series, we wanted to do an episode about content. And we started brainstorming. We went through and did kind of our back end notes back and forth. And we realized that if we tried to put everything that there is to talk about content in one episode, we would be doing a disservice to the topic. And that's where we decided, hey, this is an opportunity for us to do another series. Understanding, letting the content kind of dictate a little bit what the format is, within reason, but recognizing as you're producing it that you have to remain agile and adapt to what the content is telling you. If you start to do research and say, hey, I went in talking about, a particular focus that I had for this piece of content, but found out that more people are interested in this complementary one, just because you had your plan doesn't mean you shouldn't, switch gears. Switch gears and write about something that is a little bit more valuable. Your plan is just that. It's a plan. It's not something that's set in stone. It's not something that you have to adhere to religiously, but it's designed to help you move through the process as efficiently as possible. But really, at the end of the day, if you're not creating the best content that you can for your audience, you are wasting your time, or you're at least not taking full advantage of that time. So be okay with kind of switching it around and letting the content or the medium kind of suggest alternatives for you. And if it makes sense to change, then, don't be opposed to it.
Definitely. And I'm going to quickly call out some case studies that I think are really good examples of switching up the format, switching up the media mix to make what normally would be a kind of bland blog post into something really interesting and different. Distill, they're a well-known agency in the SEO space. They worked with a client in the UK to do sort of several beginner's guides, one to WordPress. I think they did one to PPC, and we'll link to them in the show notes if you go to bamboochalupa.com. But instead of just a text series of beginner's guides, they were able to create a sort of choose your own adventure wireframe diagram type content that was really, really interesting and different. Shopify does a really good job with having guided tours on various topics related directly to what they sell, which is e-commerce platforms. And then the last one I'll call out that's really well known in our industry, I think a really good example of how to break down a very, very complex and nuanced topic, is actually Moz's Beginner's Guide to SEO. I think it's a very tough topic to approach, but the way they broke it out and the way they were able to use tasteful design to really complement the content, I think was a really, really good approach to covering that topic.
And a lot of the examples that we like to give on this show is to talk really about marketing and sales, these case studies, but you can apply these concepts to, just kind of some more fun verticals as well. Deadspin is a great website. I would describe that as your irreverent sports publication, where they take a little bit of a different twist on reporting on sports news in particular. And they have a series that they call their Haters Guide. And this is an ongoing series that they put together, but they focus on this idea where, they pick on people like Derek Jeter, where when Derek Jeter started to retire, everybody had to look, there was nowhere you could go without hearing something about Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter's retirement parade lasted like 3 years, it felt like. And Deadspin takes this, they have their irreverent kind of satirical look at things, and they use this to turn it into a hater's guide to Derek Jeter. And it touches on all the things that people kind of laugh about, but it presents it in a format that appeals to their users. It meets the kind of content guidelines that they've established for their site. And they've been able to replicate this model across a lot of other things. I've been a Oakland Raiders fan for my entire life. And, they have the Haters Guide to the Oakland Raiders. They have the Haters Guide to March Madness, which is updated every year. But they've been able to produce this ongoing series based on what their audience responds well to. And that's the best type of content, where you can have something that you adapt the content to what your audience is most interested in. And when you find something that works, you find a way to expand that, to say, all right, is there we talked about a specific topic here, but is there a broader theme that we can apply to other topics to still be able to capitalize on what our audience is telling us through their engagement and through any of their comments, social shares, what have you? How can we use what our audience is telling us that they like to produce more of that content?
All right, so we have our media mix, we have our format, we have our timeline, have our content created. The next step, I will say, is to make sure you're controlling everything that you can control on your side. And so once we get into, promotion, and especially once you hit the publish button, really, you can't control how other people are going to really receive it or what other people are going to think of it. But one thing that you can control on your side is all the loose ends, all the little details that can have ultimately a big impact on how the content can be received. And I'm specifically talking about things like alt tags, which is adding descriptions to your images. Using featured images, which is, what image gets pulled into RSS readers or into social media, and things like Facebook Open Graph, where you can define the image and the description that gets pulled into the share that other people create, so that you can really define, the narrative and how things are perceived on Facebook. You could do the same thing on Twitter with Twitter cards. Things like it kills me when people do invest so much time and resources, and then they don't even think about writing a meta description, which normally is standard practice for any other page on their website. You can do things like on your email update, when you're alerting people of a new post, you can edit that snippet so that it's more engaging, so it has a stronger call to action, so that you get those few additional click-throughs.
And really what this all kind of circles back to is it circles back to creating a consistent experience with your content. Make sure that the people in the audience that are receiving your content can know what to expect. That they know if they go out there and say Nate posts, an article, anybody who's, familiar with Facebook, for example, and has posted content there before, you can change around the little description that's posted there. But most of the people who are going to reshare that aren't going to think that hard about reposting it. Think on Twitter, people hit the retweet button. They're not necessarily doing the edit and retweet or making changes to it. They just want to be able to share what was already out there. Make it as easy as possible for your content to be received by that audience once you get and you step into that promotion phase.
Other things, little things that you can do on your website where you're controlling the content is to make design a priority. Make it so that people are going to actually engage with the content and not necessarily just quote unquote read it, which on the internet usually means read the headline, read a subheading, read next steps, close browser tab. We're talking about having people actually read the content and maybe hit the share button. And, sometimes that might mean adding additional design elements. Sometimes it might mean increasing the font size. But again, all these things are small details that you can control that in the context of the investment that you're putting into the content really aren't that much.
Yeah, and it really makes sure that people can do more than just read it. The idea is that they're not just reading the content. You want them to engage with that content. You want to be able to put the words it's not just words on a page, it's a story. You want this, by placing priority on design, you're able to tell a more cohesive story with this content, which pushes engagement much further than just simply words on the page would. And it comes back to that idea of a consistent and consolidated theme around the goals. The goals, if it's just eyeballs or page views, that's different than if it's, putting in a call to action. I know Nate mentioned having a call to action in, just a minute ago, but including a call to action in your content allows you to control that user experience even after they finish doing what they came to the site to do, which is engage with that content or read that content. Including a call to action, even if it's, hey, sign up for more, sign up for an email newsletter, or it's, hey, here are some related posts that you might be interested in. Give people the opportunity, should they choose to do so, to take another step and continue to participate with your content. Make sure that we have things like strong headings and titles. Get things where people have to be able to, you have to draw people in with your content. Make sure that nobody's going to read the article and then circle back and read the title. The first thing that everybody is going to look at is your title or your heading. Make sure that that is written and, promoted in a way that is telling that story that you want to tell and going and accomplishing the goals that you set out back in that planning process.
One of the other loose ends that I love to double check on is sources. Linking out to reputable sources shows the user that what you are creating isn't just your opinion, that you have ways to back it up. And you're also doing them a benefit by, if they want to, do a deep dive on a certain thing that you mentioned, they can find those additional resources and you get a little bit of a brand credit by being the curator, by being the expert.
And I love sources, and I love particularly linking out to other sources, because you can talk about the idea of, using sources as a way to initiate conversations with the people that you sourced out to curate links back. But I'm actually, even just from a technical standpoint, I've actually been a believer for a long time that linking out is a positive SEO experience. And it's a positive SEO strategy in that it can help your site's SEO value by linking out to other sites. And the reason for this is it comes back to what users ultimately want. Remember, search engines design their algorithm to support what the user ultimately wants. And if we're going out there and we're linking out to other content, that is the natural way in which the web evolved, was by people linking from one to the other. By links, there's a lot of people who put no follows on all of their external links. There's a lot of people who just won't link to anything but, content inside their own site. But by linking out to another site, if you think about the way the web has naturally evolved, and you think about the way that this is how you have an opportunity to associate yourself with high quality and highly authoritative sites, yeah, it's clearly not as valuable as them linking back and endorsing you, but you're almost introducing yourself into the same neighborhood as these high quality sources. And you're showing the search engine that if you link out to 5 highly authoritative, very related, very relevant sources, you are almost putting yourself in that conversation, putting yourself in that context that all of our SEO strategies are designed to do. And that's to curate these trust and these authority signals.
I can't second that enough. But just to wrap up the controlling what you can control section, proofread your post.
Yeah, this is not meant to insult anybody here,
no.
But it really, it's unbelievable how often you can see really extraordinary content just completely have the legs taken out from under it because there was a typo in the first sentence.
No, and
it turns a lot of people off.
And full transparency, I was actually the one who added this because this is a problem on from my experience. I can't tell you how many times I will, publish newsletter after newsletter, post after post. I get a few comments, whatever. But the day I mix up there and there, that's when the emails start coming in, and which is great, but it's not good because that's what people remember the post for. And so if that means having another person take a look at your post, if it means getting an editor, if it means, reading the post backwards, do something to make sure that the loose details are tied off so that people are paying attention to the right things.
Yeah, these types of avoidable mistakes, like proofreading, these types of avoidable mistakes detract from your content in a way that's almost impossible to quantify. You see all the grammar Nazis, the self-proclaimed grammar Nazis that pride themselves on picking out typos in content, and then that becomes the focus. No longer is the focus on the research that you did. No longer is the focus on the story you're trying to tell. It's now focused on the fact that you used, who instead of whom, or you used your instead of your, or it's with or without the apostrophe. These little things that detract from, that seem so minor and so insignificant, really can derail an entire piece of content if that becomes the focus and it takes the attention away from our core goals.
Oh yeah. Well, let's talk about the author. I think that's, we talk a lot about the actual content and the people who are going to be reading it, but I think that the person behind the content, the person actually writing it or authoring it or driving the project, has a huge role to play in not only the content creation, but also the planning, and then I'd say especially in the promotion aspect of it.
Well, I think talking about the author as well is, remember that the author is part of the story. The storyteller is part of that story. So the person who creates the content is an integral part of it. Duh, of course they are. But more than just a tool to be able to create the content, look at the authors, especially if you manage a team or if you're an author yourself. Understand that the personality that you inject into your content, the fact that this becomes an extension of yourself, it is a way to communicate with people using your voice and using, the words on the page. This is how you can highlight the author to be able to support the overall goals of the content. It makes it more relatable when people can relate to the author. They can relate better to the story. So if you can involve any sort of a personal touch, if you can say, hey, yeah, Google authorship is gone. But if you're involved in social media, whether that's Google+, Twitter, Facebook, try to find some way to encourage people to engage with you there. Take advantage of the author's personality to give the content personality.
Yeah, and when I quickly think of some of the better business corporate blogs, this is actually a big part of it. I think about 37 Signals, which in a way built a lot of their business off their blog. I think about Jason Fried and David Hennemeyer Hansen, who really inject their personality and their worldview into their posts. Virgin Airlines, they have a very well trafficked airline entrepreneurship blog, and it revolves around the personality of Richard Branson. And I think that just because you're a business doesn't mean you can't have individual personalities who really drive the content and make it more relatable and less corporate in a way.
The author becomes the champion of the content. Do you think that Apple's, products have gotten, whether, you may or may not, but I don't think Apple's products have gotten much, any different since Steve Jobs passed away. But the way that people respond to product launches and releases has changed dramatically. Because even if somebody went up there and gave the exact same talk, exact same presentation, you didn't have that same Steve Jobs touch to it. Something changes when you take the author out of the equation. So as you're creating that, don't see yourself as the author or the team that you manage as the authors as being just a conduit to go from thoughts to words. See your authors as a very integral part of the entire process and make them part of the story. And the last thing that we want to talk about here, and we're going to kind of regroup it at the end, is something that Nate and I have talked about quite a bit. And this is actually advice that I think, Nate, I may have given you a couple years ago when I was proofreading one of your posts. And it comes down to the idea that when you write something, don't publish it right away. You want to give yourself a chance to take a step back, see feedback from someone, and then someone that you trust. And it helps you avoid that tunnel vision that leads to typos. It leads to, missing particular or great sources. It leads to trying, just exhaustion at the end of a post where the beginning becomes so much better than the end. But you want to kind of consider taking a step back and building time in for that, the process, so that you can allow yourself to relax, come back fresh, and make sure that you're taking one final, run at your content with a fresh set of eyes, whether they be yours or somebody else's, to make sure that it's as good as it can be.
Yeah, and so the one thing that I'll add in here is that a lot of times if you think about your goals, and again, this is especially true if you're going for just organic growth, but even if you're trying to go viral and have social media success, is that you can go with a soft launch. Go ahead and publish, but don't go heavy on the promotion. By publishing, you can get that initial bit of feedback from your core of dedicated readers or from internal team and see if this has potential. See if there's anything that needs to be revised or updated or fixed, because a lot of times that doesn't become apparent until you push something out to the world. And once you get that fixed, that's when you can go and start with your promotion plan. And keep in mind, a lot of times content has an incredibly long fuse. There's example after example of things that eventually went viral, but were sort of sitting on a shelf on a blog somewhere until all of a sudden they got picked up by Twitter or Reddit or StumbleUpon or somewhere. And so, unless your marketing plan revolves around the big launch that you've been teasing to your audience for months and months and months, or that is very, very time sensitive, think about going with a soft launch and again, taking that step back to see if you have to hit the publish button when you've planned on hitting the publish button.
And kind of to expand on that, there was a post that Ross Hudgens wrote. Ross owns Siege Media out, I believe, in California, maybe in Washington. I'm not sure. But we've talked about Ross before. He's one of the sharpest minds in digital marketing, somebody that I've looked up to, admired, and learned a lot from over the course of my career. But he wrote a great post, which, God, has to be 6-7 months ago now. And he talked about this idea of dealing with what he calls content launch anxiety. That you've spent all this time creating the content, that you're sure that, I'm confident that the idea that I chose was solid. I'm confident that I put all the work into it correctly. I'm confident it covers everything that I want to accomplish the goals. But I'm not that confident. You get to the end and you get to the point where it comes down to hit publish and you get a little nervous about how it's going to be perceived. And I think that's where it comes down to this idea. And I love that kind of concept of content launch anxiety, because whether or not to forget a name, I think anybody who's ever written consistently, especially in the internet age, understands this feeling where you don't know how it's going to be received, but sooner or later you have to take that leap. And whether you take that leap by going out there with a full-fledged promotional campaign using all the tips we're going to give you in the next episode, or you go into it saying, hey, I'm just going to publish it and see if it's just people who are already subscribed to my RSS feed. These are the people who have opted in. I'm now going with a full 100% inbound approach where it's only people who have opted in to receive this content are the ones who are going to give me initial feedback. If I'm used to getting, X number of reads during the first couple of days and I got significantly higher or lower than that, it gives you an idea of how that content is being received and whether or not changes might be warranted to improve the quality of that content before you execute this entire promotional campaign. So when you come down, if you're faced with any of this content launch anxiety, or you're really not sure how people are going to receive it and you want to get some feedback, consider publishing without promoting. Everything we've talked about for the last 20, 25 minutes or so really comes down to one key premise, and that's you have to find your style. Everybody is different, and we've talked about a number of these kind of principles that are important to remember during the creation process. But at the end of the day, you have to create. It's a very personal experience to create something. What works for me may not work for Nate. What works for Nate may not work for our listeners, and vice versa. What works for you guys may not work with our style, but what we really encourage you to do, make sure that we're going in there and we're controlling everything that we can control. Make sure that we know that we're leveraging the author as part of the story, that we're giving ourselves enough time to produce the right type of content, and that we're using the appropriate media mix or format that aligns with our style, our voice, and the needs of our audience. But at the end of the day, you have to be confident. You have to be proud of the content that you went and published, and you have to be willing to promote that content. It's amazing how many people don't even want to share their own content because they're afraid of how that will be perceived, or they're not that confident that it was that strong content. You need to make sure that when you go out there that you find your style, that you find something that is really kind of pulls everything together and makes it your own, and then write that where it appeals and it aligns with your audience.
All right, well, you can find previous episodes, including part 1 of this series, links to things that we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. Next episode, we will be continuing this series covering promoting the content that we just created. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave a comment and rating while you're there. It gives us great feedback and helps others discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.